They placed her napkin at the wrong table on purpose. She said nothing. She simply smiled and waited. The wedding breakfast for His Grace the Duke of Ellaby and Miss Cecily Hart was laid in the great saloon at Ellaby House, Park Lane, on the 14th of June 1820, for 140 guests, and the seating had been settled a fortnight earlier by the Duke's aunt, Lady Honoria Ferris, who had gone down the list with a pencil and had come to the name Mrs. Talbot and had made a small mark beside it. So when the doors opened, the card bearing that name was found at the long trestle set up at the far end under the musicians' gallery among the upper servants of the great families, the ladies' maids, the confidential men, the 2 agents, the bride's father's clerk. It was not a mistake. 3 people had checked it. Margaret Talbot stood over that card for perhaps 4 seconds. She was 30 years old, a widow of 5 years, in black silk of a quality that had made 2 duchesses look twice on the way in, and she had been driven to Park Lane that morning in her own carriage from her own house in Bedford Square. She looked at the card. She looked, without hurrying, down the length of the saloon at the top table, where Lady Honoria Ferris was very carefully not looking back. And then Margaret Talbot did the thing that nobody in that room had prepared for, which was to sit down. She sat down at the servants' table and shook out her napkin and said good morning to a lady's maid named Dorcas Pym, who had gone scarlet on her behalf, and asked her, pleasantly, whether the Bedfordshire road had been very bad, and then, while the soup came round, she tipped her head back and looked up at the ceiling. The narrator asks the listener to attend to that, because it is the whole of the story. There is a plaster cornice in the great saloon at Ellaby House, run in 1806 for the 5th Duke, 11 inches deep. A band of acanthus and bellflower going round the entire room, and there is a small mark cast into the return at the north-east corner where the plasterer's firm signed its work in the way such firms did. Margaret Talbot looked up at that mark from the servants' table under the musicians' gallery at a wedding she had been insulted at on purpose, and she smiled. Because the mark said Talbot and Sons, and Josiah Talbot had been her husband, and the ceiling of that saloon had been made by the man who taught her the trade. And because she had bought the freehold of the ground it all stood on in the November of 1817. The narrator will now go back 11 years, because none of what follows makes sense otherwise. In the March of 1809, Miss Margaret Ives had been companion to the Dowager Duchess of Ellaby for 1 year and 11 months. She was 19. Her father had been a curate in Huntingdonshire, who died leaving her £40 and a good hand, and companion to a duchess was the highest thing such a girl could hope for, and very nearly the worst, being a station with the manners of a lady and the wages of an upper housemaid and the security of neither. On the 16th of March 1809, a bandeau of diamonds and emeralds, valued at £440, went missing from the Dowager Duchess's dressing room at Ellaby House. Margaret Ives was accused of taking it, on no evidence beyond the fact that she had access, that she was the only person in that house without a family behind her, and that the alternative was to suspect somebody the Dowager Duchess could not afford to suspect. She was searched, which the narrator mentions once and will not describe. She was dismissed within 4 hours, without a character, and put out of the area door in the rain at 8 in the evening. She was not prosecuted. That was the mercy the family congratulated itself on for 11 years. What she did with the following 11 years was not romantic, and the narrator declines to make it so. A young woman turned off without a character in London in 1809 has 3 roads, and 2 of them are terrible. Margaret Ives took the third, which was her aunt's chandler's shop in Southwark, and she kept the books of it for 2 years, and in 1811 she married Josiah Talbot, a plasterer and builder of Great Suffolk Street, 49, a widower, and a great deal cleverer than his coat suggested. It was not a love match at the beginning, and became one by about 1813. He taught her the paper rather than the trowel, how a building lease is drawn, what a ground rent is worth, why a term with 61 years to run is a different animal from the same term with 11. He died in the November of 1815 and left her the firm, 4 ground leases in Somerstown, and a written instruction to his foreman that Mrs. Talbot's word was to be taken as his own. In the 4.5 years after that, Margaret Talbot turned 4 ground leases into 91. She did it by buying what nobody fashionable wanted: unfinished terraces, the reversions of dying tradesmen, the awkward corner parcels behind the great squares. Out of a counting house with 2 clerks and a fireproof closet, and she was known in the city entirely and only as Mrs. Talbot, nobody there had ever heard of Margaret Ives. That had been the point. And in the November of 1817 there came onto the market, through 2 intermediaries, the freehold of a parcel of ground on the east side of Park Lane, sold out of the Ellaby estate in 1808 by a duke drowning in debt, who had taken back a 60-year lease on his own house in order to go on living in it. She bought it for £11,300, and she told nobody at all. Adrian Ferris, 6th Duke of Ellaby, was 28 years old on his wedding day, and he had been Duke for 4 years, and he owned, in the whole world, nothing. The narrator states it plainly because he had lately begun to state it plainly to himself. The Northamptonshire seat was entailed. The London house stood on somebody else's ground. The £48,000 of debt his father assembled between 1804 and 1816 was his to service and not his to have spent. And the £70,000 Miss Cecily Hart would bring was the reason for the flowers, the musicians, the 140 guests, and the tightness at the back of his jaw he had carried since Easter. He noticed the woman at the servants' table because she was the only person in that saloon who was not performing. Everybody else in the room was working. His aunt was working the top table. The bride's father was working the Duke's cousin. Cecily Hart, 22 years old, was smiling steadily at a great many people in a manner he had begun, uneasily, to recognise as the smile of somebody counting the courses. And down at the far end, under the gallery, a woman in black silk had shaken out a napkin she had every reason to throw on the floor, said something kind to a lady's maid, and then looked up at the ceiling and smiled at it as though it had told her a joke. He watched her for the length of 2 courses. He saw her stop a footman with 2 fingers and say something quiet, and the footman look at his own bottle and go red and correct his pouring hand. He saw her run her eye along the window reveals and up the pilasters, and across to the chimney-piece in a particular unhurried order, the way a man looks over a horse, and he understood, without being able to say how, that she was not admiring the room. She was valuing it. Nothing had been valued for Adrian Ferris in 4 years, except by his own creditors. It was Lady Honoria Ferris who broke it open, at the dessert, and she did it because Sir Lionel Pace asked her to. He was 31, the late Dowager Duchess's nephew, and therefore the Duke's first cousin, knighted in 1818 for services to a loan, and standing that summer for a Wiltshire borough, and he had made a good deal of money out of London building ground in 6 years, and lost a quantity of it. In 2 to a Southwark firm he could not get the measure of. He had recognised Margaret Talbot from the top of the steps at 9 that morning, and had spent 5 hours in a great deal of quiet fear, and the seating had been his suggestion a fortnight before for one exact reason, to find out whether she would make a scene. If she made a scene, she was still Margaret Ives, and could be dealt with as Margaret Ives. She had not made a scene. So he tried the other way. Aunt Honoria, he said, pitched to carry. In the small lull that comes when the ices arrive, you have a builder's widow at the servants' table, and she has been staring at your ceiling for 2 hours. Do ask her what she makes of it. I am sure the trade has opinions. The laugh that went round the top table was not universal, but it was loud, and 140 people turned to look down the length of the saloon at the woman in black silk. Lady Honoria Ferris, delighted, said, "Well, Mrs. Talbot? Do you find the house handsome?" Margaret Talbot set down her spoon and rose to her feet at the servants' table, unhurried, and the narrator will report that she did not raise her voice, because there was no longer the least need. "I do, my lady. I have thought so for some years." She glanced up once at the northeast return of the cornice. That cornice was run in the spring of 1806 by Talbot and Sons of Great Suffolk Street, 11 inches deep, acanthus and bellflower. And there is the firm's mark cast into the corner above Sir Lionel's head, which you may all see for yourselves if anyone cares to stand up. Josiah Talbot made this ceiling. He was my husband. I have been looking at it because it is the finest thing in this room, and because I have not seen it in 14 years. Nobody laughed at all now. And as to the house, she folded her napkin and laid it on the trestle, squarely, the way a person does who has finished. The 5th Duke sold the freehold of this ground in the September of 1808 and took back a lease of 60 years to go on living here, which was a sensible thing to do with a debt and a very expensive thing to do with a grandson. That freehold changed hands twice. It was bought in the November of 1817 for £11,300 by the firm of Talbot and Company. She looked, for the first time, directly at the top table. "Which is myself. You are all extremely welcome. I am the ground landlord, my lady, and I did not come here to say so, and I would not have said so if I had been left in peace to eat an ice at the bottom of the room." The silence in the great saloon at Ellaby House lasted, by the account of 3 separate people who were in it, something over 11 seconds. And into that silence Miss Cecily Hart stood up at the top table beside her bridegroom of 2 hours and said, quite clearly, "I should like to go home." She was 22 years old and she had £70,000, and she had been watching that seating arrangement since the doors opened. "Papa, I should like to go home, and I should like it understood by everybody in this room that I do not blame His Grace, who did not make the list, and that I very much do blame the people who did." Her voice shook, and she went on through it. "I have been 3 months being told what a great family this is. I have watched this family put a widow at the servants' table on purpose to amuse itself, and I have watched it laugh, and I find I do not wish to be a duchess on those terms, or on any terms that come with that. I am extremely sorry, Your Grace. You have been nothing but civil to me, and I do not think you have been happy for 1 hour of it either." The narrator sets down that Adrian Ferris, who had that morning married £70,000 he needed more than air, stood up and said, "You are quite right, and I am not going to argue with you in front of 140 people, and I will hand you to your carriage myself." He did. The marriage was annulled in the November term, unconsummated and uncontested, and Cecily Hart married a physician in 1823, and was, by every account that reached Park Lane, extremely happy. He came down the length of the emptying saloon 3/4 of an hour later and found Margaret Talbot at the northeast corner, alone, with her head back, looking at the mark in the plaster. "Mrs. Talbot, I have to thank you, do not." She did not turn round. "You are about to thank me for something I did not do for you, and then we shall both have to pretend, and I have had a long morning. Then I will say the other thing instead." He stopped a proper distance off. "You have just cost me £70,000, and you have done it by telling the truth at the bottom of a table you should never have been sat at, and I find I am not able to be sorry about it, which I would not have predicted at breakfast. You will be sorry in about a fortnight, when the bills come in." "Very likely." Margaret Talbot turned round then and looked at him properly for the first time in 11 years, and he did not know that was what was happening. And she did. "May I tell you what I actually saw in this room today, Your Grace? You will not enjoy it." She waited, and he inclined his head. "I saw a man of 28 being married in a house he does not own, on ground he rents from me, to pay debts he did not incur, before 140 people who were all doing business. In 2 hours I did not once see you ask your bride a question. I know rather a lot about this house. I looked at it very carefully before I paid £11,000 for the ground under it, and I have not been able to find one single thing in the whole of it that is yours." She said it without cruelty, which was what made it land like a struck match. "That is the truest sentence anybody has spoken to me since my father died," said Adrian Ferris. "Yes, it is a habit of people nobody has ever needed anything from." She picked up her gloves. "Good afternoon, Your Grace." Adrian Ferris did not sleep that night, and at 9 the following morning he did a thing no Duke of Ellaby had done in living memory, which was to go down to the housekeeper's room and ask to see the character book. He read it back to 1806, and on the 16th of March, 1809, in his mother's own hand, he found 4 lines dismissing Miss M. Ives, companion, without character, on suspicion of theft, and he sat on a hard chair in a stone passage in his own basement, and remembered, entire and in order, a thing he had put away when he was 17 years old. He had been on the stairs. He had liked her. She had read to his mother every evening for 2 years, and had taught him, in the summer of 1808, how to lay out a ground plan to scale with a rule and a piece of string, because he had asked her, and nobody else in that house would have troubled. And on the 16th of March, 1809, he had stood on the half landing at 9 o'clock in the evening, while 2 footmen put her out of the area door in the rain, with a bundle, and he had said nothing at all, because he was 17 and his mother was on the landing above him. He had thought about it, he reckoned, perhaps 400 times in 11 years. The old butler, Mr. Pilcher, 71, and pensioned and still living in the Mews, confirmed the whole of it in 10 minutes that afternoon, and added, without being asked, that there had never been a soul below stairs who believed it, and that the general opinion in 1809 had been that the young gentleman staying in the house that week had lost a good deal at cards on the Tuesday and paid it on. The Friday. The young gentleman staying in the house that week had been Lionel Pace, aged 19. Adrian went to Bedford Square that evening, and Margaret Talbot received him in her own front room among her own furniture, and let him get the whole of it out standing up. "I am not going to insult you by asking whether it was you," he said. "I have read my mother's hand, and I have talked to Pilcher, and I have remembered where I was standing. You were 19 years old, and you had £40 in the world, and my family put you into the street in the rain on no evidence at all, and I was on the stairs, and I did not open my mouth. I have come to say that. I am aware it is 11 years and £440 too late. And I am aware I have nothing whatever to offer as. Stop apologising. Margaret Talbot put both hands flat on the table. You were 17. Your mother is dead and I cannot get anything out of her, and I have stopped wanting to. You are not the man who wronged me, Your Grace. You are only the boy who was in the room, and there were 9 of those, and I have never once blamed the footman either. She looked up at him. Sir Lionel Pace is the man who wronged me. He has known who I am since 9 o'clock yesterday morning, and he had me put at that table to find out whether I would scream. Now stop telling me what you failed to do in 1809 and tell me what you intend to do this week. Adrian Ferris was quiet a moment. What do you need? His hand, she said, in writing. In 1809 she had been looking for it for 11 years, and she told him how, that evening, sitting down because he asked and did not flinch. A stolen bandeau in London in 1809 went one of 3 ways, and 2 of them left no paper. The third was a pawnbroker, and a pawnbroker, by Act of Parliament, kept a book. So from 1812 onward she had made it her business to see the pledge books of every pawnbroker within 1.5 miles of Park Lane, first by asking, then, when asking failed, by the slower method of buying the freeholds of their premises. It took her 7 years and 94 volumes. She found it on the 9th of November 1819 in the 3rd book of Mr. Ambrose Havell of Great Suffolk Street, the 17th of March 1809. 1 bandeau, diamond and emerald, pledged for £180. In the name of L. Payne, in a hand she had by then seen on 4 years of business correspondence, and could have identified in her sleep. And you did nothing with it for 7 months. I had it copied and sworn before a magistrate at Union Hall the same week, and then I did nothing at all. Because I have known since I was 19 exactly how much a tradeswoman's word weighs against a knight's. And I have been getting heavier. Margaret Talbot smiled slightly. I had rather thought I would be ready in about 1823. And now? And now he has seen me. So it is this year. There was a thing that happened in that house late in the evening on the 11th of July, after 9 weeks of a business she was conducting and he was carrying documents for, and the narrator sets it down because both of them remembered it. She took a candle up to the great saloon at Ellaby House at 11 at night, at his asking, to show him the mark in the cornice, the actual mark, close to, from the top of a library ladder, Talbot and Sons cast into the plaster of the north-east return, where nobody in 14 years had thought to look. He held the ladder. She came down it 3 rungs and stopped, and he was standing at the foot of it with the candle, and her hand was on the rail an inch from his, and neither of them moved for a considerable time. "You have not once asked me," Adrian said, "what I mean to do about this house. No, it is your affair and my ground, and I have been waiting to see whether you would raise it yourself." Her voice had gone quieter than she meant it to. "You are standing very close to a ladder, Your Grace." "I am aware of where I am standing. I am 2 years older than you. I am in trade. I was put out of that door in the rain, and there is not a drawing-room in London that would not choke on it." "I have been in a great many drawing-rooms," said Adrian Ferris, "and I have not owned one thing in any of them." The clock on the landing struck the quarter, and she came down the last 3 rungs and went past him to blow out the candle, and neither of them said anything else, and the moment went out with the light. Margaret Talbot did the irreversible thing on the 2nd of August, in public, before she had authenticated a single document. There is a room at the auction mart in Bartholomew Lane, where the men who dealt in London building ground met on the first Wednesday, and she stood up in it, in front of 61 of them, including 4 of her own bankers. and named Sir Lionel Pace, Knight, candidate for Melcombe, as the man who had stolen a bandeau from the Dowager Duchess of Ellaby in the March of 1809 and pledged it in Southwark for £180 under a false name, and had allowed a girl of 19 to be turned into the street for it. She invited him from the floor to sue her for it. He sued her for it within 9 days, which was exactly what she had wanted, and the narrator will not pretend that the fortnight following was anything but the worst of her life since 1809. Because Lionel Pace was not a fool. He had bought Mr. Havel's business out of a bankruptcy in the March of that year. He had bought it, he said afterward, as an investment, and when the libel action was entered, he had the third pledge book, and by the middle of August the third pledge book did not exist, and there were 14 men in the city prepared to say so. He did the rest properly too. 11 of Margaret Talbot's 91 leases stood on a head lease he had quietly acquired in 1819, and on the 21st of August he forfeited all 11 for a technical breach of covenant, which was worth £9,400, and was, his own counsel privately admitted. Perfectly good law. 2 of her bankers withdrew in the same week. The Morning Post ran 3 paragraphs every Wednesday about a Southwark widow and the origins of her fortune. And Adrian Ferris could do nothing, and had to be seen doing nothing, because the one thing that would finish her was for the world to decide the Duke of Ellaby had put a woman up to accusing his own cousin. He wrote twice, and she returned both letters unopened, with a line on the outside of the second in her own hand, "Not until it is over." M.T. She sat in her counting house through the last week of August with £9,400 gone, 2 bankers gone, and no original, and she did not weep until the Friday, and then only once, and her clerk went out into the yard and stood there until she had finished. The libel action of Pace v. Talbot came on before a special jury in the Court of King's Bench in the 2nd week of November 1820, and it went, in the end, very quickly. Sir Lionel Pace's counsel opened on the simple proposition that there was no book. Margaret Talbot's counsel then put in, one after another, 3 things: an attested copy of the entry of the 17th of March 1809, made and sworn before a magistrate at Union Hall on the 9th of November 1819, 11 months before Sir Lionel Pace had ever bought a pawnbroker's business, which the magistrate's clerk, still in office, identified from his own register. Mr. Ambrose Havel, 78 years old, retired to Camberwell, who had sold his business to Sir Lionel Pace in the March of 1820, and had not sold him his memory, and who stated on oath that the gentleman who pledged the bandeau had come in on foot at 4 in the afternoon, and had signed the name L. Payne, and that he remembered it because the young gentleman had wept. And 9 years of Sir Lionel Pace's own business correspondence, in his own hand, put in beside the attested copy for the jury to compare at their leisure. The Duke of Ellaby was the last witness, and was not obliged to be. He went into the box and said, before 41 newspapermen, that his mother, the late Dowager Duchess, had dismissed Miss Margaret Ives on no evidence whatsoever. That he had been 17 and present and silent, that the household had believed at the time his cousin lost money at cards on the Tuesday and paid it on the Friday, and that he knew his evidence would be called, got up out of interest, and had considered that, and had come anyway. The jury found for the defendant in 11 minutes. He found her afterward on the steps outside, in the November dark, alone, because her counsel had gone back in, and her clerk had gone for the carriage, and there was nobody at all standing with the woman who had just won. "You returned my letters," Adrian said. "I returned them unopened, which is different, and I have got both of them in a drawer, and I intend to read them tonight." Her voice was not steady. You did not have to go into that box. You were told by 3 separate men that it would be said you had got it up out of interest. It was said. It will go on being said. He came up 1 step and stopped. Margaret, I have been 11 weeks not writing to you and 4 months not saying this, and it is over now, so I am going to say it badly on a public staircase. I have nothing. That is not modesty, it is an inventory. The seat is entailed, the house stands on your ground, and the one thing I have done in 28 years that I am not ashamed of, I did this afternoon in a witness box, because you told me in June to stop apologising and do something instead. His voice had gone rough. I am not offering you a rescue. You have just rescued yourself in front of 41 newspapermen. I am asking whether a man who owns nothing may be permitted to stand next to a woman who has built everything, for the rest of it, and be no use to her at all, except in the ways she tells me. Margaret Talbot looked at him for a long moment on the steps of the Court of King's Bench. I was 19 years old on the other side of that door, she said, and I told myself, walking away from it in the rain, that I would never once in my life ask anybody for anything again. And I have kept to it, Adrian, and it has made me a considerable fortune, and it has been the loneliest 11 years I can imagine. Then let me be the exception and keep the rule for everybody else. She laughed at that, wrecked once, with her eyes full, and closed the last step herself, which the narrator sets down plainly, for there was nothing in the world compelling her to do it. What passed between them then was brief, and what broke open in her was not triumph, which she had already had in 11 minutes from a jury, but the plain, unbearable relief of being wanted by a man who had watched her win, and had not once mistaken it for something he had done for her. Sir Lionel Pace withdrew from the borough of Melcombe the following week, and was indicted in the Hillary term for the theft of 1809, which the law of that day still permitted, and he was convicted, and he was transported for 14 years. And he sailed in the September of 1821. The 11 forfeited leases were restored by a decree of the Court of Chancery in 1822, on the ground that the forfeiture had been exercised for a collateral purpose, and Margaret Talbot got her £9,400 and 11 years of interest. Lady Honoria Ferris removed to Cheltenham in the spring of 1821, and is not further mentioned in this account. The bandeau itself was recovered from a jeweller in Norwich, having been redeemed and broken up and reset twice in 11 years. Margaret would not wear it and would not keep it. She had the stones sold, and the £440, with interest calculated to the day, paid into a fund for the relief of women dismissed from service without a character, administered from a room behind Great Suffolk Street, which by 1840 had placed 911 of them. They were married in the June of 1822, quietly, at St Pancras, with Mr Pilcher, the retired butler, and Dorcas Pym, the lady's maid, among the 11 people present, both of them invited by the bride, and neither of them seated anywhere she had not chosen herself. The freehold of the ground on the east side of Park Lane stayed in Margaret's own name for the whole of her life, and Adrian never once asked her to alter it, on the stated ground that a man who had reached 28, owning nothing, had no business acquiring an £11,000 freehold by marriage, and Talbot and Company went on being Talbot and Company. And the Duchess of Ellerby was in the counting-house behind Great Suffolk Street 3 days a week until she was 61 years old. On a bright morning in the May of 1824, in the great saloon at Ellerby House, there were 2 men on a scaffold at the north-east corner, taking a squeeze of the cornice. The Duke came in and stood underneath and looked up. "They are matching it," his wife said, "from the middle of the room, where she was standing with her head back and her hands behind her. The whole of the West Range wants doing, and there is not a man in London running that section any more, so we are taking a mould off Josiah's and running the new work off it. It will be the same 11 inches and the same bellflower, and it will be his profile on both sides of this house for as long as the house stands. And the mark stays. Margaret Ferris did not look away from the ceiling. And they are cutting a second one in the new work at the southwest corner, and I am told it is to say Talbot and CO, which is myself, and I have had a very great deal of argument with the foreman about the ampersand. Adrian Ferris came and stood beside her and looked up at 11 inches of acanthus and bellflower made in 1806 by a plasterer in Great Suffolk Street. 14 years ago, he said, you sat under that at the servants' table and smiled at it. I did. Were you smiling because you owned the ground, or because he made the ceiling? Margaret thought about it for a moment, honestly, the way she thought about everything. Neither, she said. I was smiling because I had walked in at the front door. I had been in that room 100 times before, Adrian, and never once by the front door, and no arrangement of napkins on this earth was going to take that back off me. The ground was only the part I could say out loud.